obviously, it's all, uh, this is all stuff that I only learned about from the family later. But we moved from the Bronx to Elizabeth, New Jersey to live with my grandmother. Now, that family was quite interesting because my grandmother and grandfather moved to the United States in the 1890s, probably around 1890. And my grandfather had come after being an apprentice tailor in England and set up a men's clothing operation in Elizabeth, which was very successful. And he was the man about town. He liked cars, he got into all kinds of things. My grandmother was much more interested in the religious side of life, and she became really instrumental in persuading a rabbi in Elizabeth to set up a congregation. And the congregation was an Orthodox congregation. And the rabbi, his name was Prail, and he later had a son-in-law, Rabbi Teitz, who was the man who really built the congregation in Elizabeth, New Jersey. That congregation was what was called modern Orthodox, which is to say that it was not Hasidic. It was a congregation that was very Orthodox in following halacha and every other aspect of Jewish life, but no payas, none of the things that you would associate with the Orthodoxy of the Hasidic community in Brooklyn, and the people who were in the congregation all participated in a normal life of the community. They weren't sort of a community unto themselves. As a result of principally my grandmother's influence, because neither of my parents had had much Jewish education, I wound up being sent to what was then the brand new school of this congregation. It was called the Jewish Educational Center. And the first 6 grades of my education were there in Elizabeth at the Jewish Educational Center. And we had lessons in Hebrew and all sorts of Jewish subjects, but also a very full secular curriculum. When I was finished with 6th grade, the question became, what next? And the rabbi talked to my parents and suggested that I had done so well that I should be sent to yeshiva in New York and that I should commute from Elizabeth to New York City to the Lower East Side to go to what was then Yeshiva Masifta Rabbeinu Yaakov Yosef. Now, Yaakov Yosef was at one point the chief rabbi of New York, and he was sort of the father of the modern Orthodox movement. So that was the place it was named after him. Now, this yeshiva was directly in back of the building that housed the Jewish Daily Forward.
Really? The one that was written in all Yiddish and
Yes, all Yiddish. At that time, it was publishing as a daily newspaper in Yiddish.
Wow.
And this was about a block and a half from the Educational Alliance, which was a big center for immigrant integration in the US. And the kids that were in school with me included a significant number of kids who had come from DP camps in Europe.
Wow.
Some had been actually rescued from concentration camps. And some of the teachers as well, particularly the teachers on the Hebrew side of the curriculum, had been rescued from concentration camps in Eastern Europe. The way the school was set up, we would have Hebrew lessons in the morning and then go secular at about 2 in the afternoon till 6 at night.
God.
So, and that was 6 days a week. We would have a half day on Friday and nothing on Shabbos, obviously.
Right.
It was a 6 day a week program.
And what did you do on Shabbos typically? Like, what would it be like? What would your day be
Typically,
like?
well, then you were back at home and you were expected to go to shul.
Oh, a shul
That
from
was
the.
the, it was full time and attention, not
That's
much time off in this.
right.
So that was the way life was in high school, and the curriculum that was the Hebrew curriculum. It probably shouldn't be called Hebrew curriculum because most of the time was spent translating Talmud and the commentaries on Talmud
Oh my God.
from Aramaic to Yiddish.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Not
so
neither Hebrew nor English are part of those two languages.
right, correct.
Well,
And of course,
the Talmud was written in a combination of Hebrew and Aramaic, so you may have had Hebrew,
yeah, there
but
were Hebrew words. Obviously,
right.
it was a mixture, and in fact, it not unlike Yiddish, a language that was a polyglot mixture of languages. But the Aramaic, obviously, was a language that was the lingua franca, if you will, of the
Yeah.
region back in the time the Talmud was written.
Absolutely. And that's why the
So,
Talmud was written in fact, that explains, by the way, why, whether and people don't necessarily know this, but things like the Kaddish, that prayer is written in
yes,
Aramaic because
yeah.
this was such an important prayer for people to say that they wanted to make sure that they were saying it in the language that they knew.
Of course. And
Yeah.
then Pesach, when there are parts of the Seder, Holach Ma'anya is
Yeah. It's in
uh,
Aramaic.
Aramaic. Okay. Well, some of the things we covered in studying Talmud were things that I began to realize would not be particularly useful to me in later life. So some of those things included how to tell whether a chicken is kosher. Uh, you know, there was quite a bit of stuff there that was very interesting. Some of it was law.
That's right. Maybe you were inspired to go into law as a
Well,
result.
a number of my classmates, in fact, wound up as lawyers because there was a lot of this legal discussion. Uh, Bava Metzia, these sections of Talmud really, what do you do if you find something on the street?
That's right.
Whose is it? How do we know whose it is? That sort of thing.
Two people grab onto a talus at the same time. One says it's mine and the other one says it's mine. Whose is
Right,
it?
right. And then things like how to make an eruv.
Right.
And so you could carry on Shabbos and all
Absolutely.
of that. Well, and of course, that was what my school program was like. And it didn't leave a lot of time for anything else because I would leave the house at 6:30 in the morning and come home at 6:30 at night.
Oh,
Not terrific. It did not enamor me of the regimen. And
jeez.
then in the summer, I was sent to a camp in the Adirondacks, Camp North Star.
Ah,
Camp North Star was where all of the kids, it was a co-ed camp, where all of the kids who were connected to schools in this modern Orthodox movement would spend the summer. And we'd be there for a full 8-week summer.
mhm.
And that camp was run as as a strictly Orthodox camp, obviously, kashrut, and then services, regular services, morning, afternoon, Shacharis, Mincha, Ma'ariv, all part of the camp routine. And of course, a Shabbos routine as well, which included a lot of singing, a lot of socializing. That was all a very pleasant experience.
Right.
And it was an opportunity to discover there were a lot of other kids who were from uh, uh, situations that were not terribly unlike my own, although I felt a little bit odd because neither my mother nor my father were particularly deeply involved in Judaism. It was my grandmother who was pushing me along, and also the rabbi in Elizabeth. Well,
But your parents obviously allowed it to happen.
yes. And a lot of that, I dare say, came out of the various tensions and problems surrounding my grandfather's death.
Right.
And one other thing that I should mention about that time was uh, when I was born, it was before World War II started. My father was gone from the time he recovered from that horrible automobile accident. He was in the military as a doctor, an MD, medical corps, and he was gone until about 1946.
Wow. Why 46? 2 years? I
Because
mean, a year and a half
they
after.
still had a lot of people to muster out of the army,
Oh my God.
and he was in charge of his field was physical medicine and rehabilitation, and that was a very much in demand field because we had all of those wounded veterans coming back and the beginnings of taking care of them. And he later went to work and finished out his career working as a doctor with the Veterans Administration, running a clinic in Newark, New Jersey. And that clinic was for people who were paraplegic, who'd lost limbs. He fitted artificial limbs, and they had a whole regimen. You've seen it now in terms of military teaching people how to walk and how to live without parts of their body.
Wait, so one second, real quickly. I'm just making sure I'm correct. So this is the you're living with your grandmother,
Right.
who is your father's mother.
No, my mother's mother.
Oh, because your dad went to the
Right.
army, so she went to live with her parents.
Right.
I
Right.
see. Okay.
Now, I had another grandmother who I didn't know terribly well. My other grandfather had died years before I was born, but the other grandmother had come to the U.S. from Vienna, probably around 1885, 1880, somewhere in there.
Right.
And that other grandmother um, uh, lived to be 95 until she was hit by a taxi cab.
Oh my God.
And she died. I think she was 95 years old when that happened.
Wait, 1 second, actually. So your father was with his father-in-law in the car at the same
Correct.
time. Okay, that's where I was a little confused.
Okay, well, it's complicated.
No. So that I just was assuming that your father was with his father in the car,
No,
and that's why I was.
Father-in-law.
Now I understand.
And yeah, and I should say a little bit about my father's family because there's a Jewish story in this too.
Go ahead.
Years later, I was trying to build, as some people do, a family tree to check out genealogy.
Right.
And I started trying to figure out who was part of my father's family because I never really got to know them at all. I had one uncle who showed up for my bar mitzvah. That was about it. So my father used to talk to a brother of his late at night, very quietly. Never knew anything much about him. It was Uncle Louis. Well, years later, I came to find out through a cousin who I connected with way late in the game, who explained to me that the reason my father was so cryptic about dealing with Uncle Louis was that when there were three brothers, and Louis was one of the three, and at age 18, he fell in love with an Italian Catholic girl.
Mm.
And he decided that was more important than anything the family was offering. And he went off and married her.
Oh boy.
The family did what immigrant families at the time did.
Disowned him.
Disowned him, sat Shiva.
Right.
And forbade his two brothers from talking to him ever again.
But your dad did it in secret.
Yeah, but can you imagine years after the parents are dead, he's still doing it in secret.
Oh my
So
God.
this was really something. And he and his Italian wife had 14 children.
14 children.
Right.
So you have 14 cousins running around somewhere.
They're essentially Italian Catholic. So if somebody says, my name is Blum, are we related? The odds are, if it's Italian Catholic, probably.
Right, but 14. Oh,
Right.
but you did know your other two uncles.
No, I knew one of the two. The Louis never quite.
Oh, there was three totals. I thought there was four total. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
So,
amazing.
but that was a piece of craziness that was very much a part of the Orthodox Jewish mindset for a long time. And it took quite a while before the community would begin to understand it had better get with the program and understand there's a rest of the world out there.
Yeah, it's such a terrible, I mean, that's a heartbreaking story on so many levels. And heartbreaking.
Of course, there are so many things that are missed with that sort of approach and that sort of attitude.
Right, but not to mention the fact that, I mean, it can cause irreparable damage to not just to your child, but to the generations. I mean, if grandkids essentially, or Louis's children
Right.
grew up kind of having a mildly skewed sense of what it means to be an adult child to your parents, because they had no, they knew that the grandparents were still alive somewhere, but just it was irrelevant.
So didn't know anything about them. And if they related to grandparents, it would have been to the grandparents on their mother's side.
Right.
So anyway, that story is one of the stories I think is more of an interesting look into what Jewish life was like back in those times. There are other things that I recall about that period of time, I would say, from my awareness of what's going on around me in the early or the late 40s, early 50s. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. And there were certain professions, certain jobs, certain places where you were sort of told this isn't for Jews.
Really?
So, for example, there were fields of study that, you just didn't get. You were told this is not where Jews are going to be very comfortable. You could be a lawyer, you could be a doctor. There were a lot of hospitals, by the way, that would not give doctors who were Jewish admitting privileges.
Wow.
And there were.
I mean, it's to think that this is New York City too, like the Jewish capital of the world outside of Jerusalem.
Yeah, well, it was less in New York City itself than around and about, if you got it, let's say within 50 miles of New York, you probably would be able to find a hospital that would allow you to practice. But if you went out into the hinterland, it got a lot rougher.
Yeah.
And there were fields of study. So, for example, I kept being told architecture was out,
Yeah. Wow.
There were just areas that Jews weren't welcome in. And this, by the way, carried over later when I went to law school. And this is now we're talking about the 1960s. I started law school in 1962. Even then, when firms came to interview on campus, there were the Jewish firms and there were the other firms. And I remember as an editor of the law school newspaper, this is at Columbia, one firm came to interview, and there was a member of the class who had a name that was obviously Polish, Lithuanian, totally unpronounceable, that hadn't been anglicized. And he went for an interview with one of the white shoe firms. And the interviewer said, what kind of name is that? And when he said it was a Jewish, Polish, Lithuanian name, he said, well, we don't have many Lithuanian clients. And that was the end of the interview.
Oh my God.
At
And he
that
wasn't
point,
even Jewish, or he was Jewish?
he was Jewish.
Oh, he was, right.
Okay, so
You know the story. You know the story about Louis Brandeis at Harvard, by the way.
no.
You know that they wanted him to be, you know, the editor of the Harvard Law Review, but they said, but the only problem is that, you know, you're a Jew.
Yeah.
And the day comes at some dinner. I'm not telling the story perfectly, but the gist is the day comes at some kind of major dinner, and he is to give a talk, and he starts off and he says, ladies and gentlemen, I want to begin this talk by saying that I'm sorry that I was born a Jew. And everyone applauds and cheers and is excited. And he then continues, after the cheering goes down, he says, I'm sorry I was born a Jew because it didn't give me the chance to choose to be a Jew. And then you could hear a pin drop in this place.
Yeah.
And the Harvard Law School anti-Semitism, the law, you know.
Yes, yes. Well, and that was still around, as I'm saying, in the 1960s.
Right. But you know, and as a result, you know, his career just petered off and never amounted to anything, did this Brandeis guy. He was just lucky to have a lot of money to donate it to make a university out of it. But he amounted to nothing.
So to go back to
Yeah,
this
you
whole period where I was going to high school, and the ethos that I was living in Elizabeth, New Jersey.
Right.
My mother was a teacher, and she taught at a high school in Newark. Wequahic High School was the name of it. Now, if you want to know, or anyone in the congregation wants to know what this was all about and life was like at the time, you got to read Philip Roth.
Right.
Philip Roth was a student of my mother's.
Oh my God.
And I will never forget coming home. I guess it was from law school. I was trying to figure out the timing. Maybe it was later. I was coming to visit I'd moved to Washington. Maybe it was then. I came back, and my mother was playing bridge with a number of her high school teacher friends. And they started talking about Philip Roth. Portnoy's Complaint had just been published.
Oh, wow.
And they were talking about this horrible pornographic book that Roth had written. And one of them said, I always knew that Roth kid would come to no good.
Yep. He also, like Brandeis, basically amounted to nothing.
Right. Now, what's fascinating, though, is if you read that book, you will get an amazing picture of Jewish life in a very intensely Jewish neighborhood in Newark at that time, because he describes all the places. It's a terrible thing to say, but at the time I knew some of the characters in Portnoy's Complaint. He wrote about real people, and he wrote about them devastatingly, but obviously not naming them.
Right, but you were able to, if not figure out exactly who he was referring to, then
Yes.
you were able to at least kind of pretty much, you knew the
Yes.
type of person he was referring to.
The type of person he was referring to. And of course, it was also a very interesting discussion in a way of my own growth over time, because he obviously was writing about what it was like to integrate into a world coming out of this intensely Jewish neighborhood. And all of the pushes and pulls and all of the things that he wrote about, the anti-Semitism, the Lindbergh business. He wrote that book, that Alternative History, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So
Plot Against America.
Plot Against America. And he was into understanding a lot of the things that I've been describing. Now, there's one other part of my growing up in that period, which I ought to tell you about.
Tell me.
My grandfather, the one who died in the car accident, who I never knew, had been part of a large family, all of whom emigrated to the United States. They, with the exception of my grandfather, had moved to Chicago and went into the jewelry business. And there were four of his brothers who married, believe it or not, four sisters from the same family.
Hmm.
So
At
you
least
talk about
it made
confusion.
or made Pesach Seder early. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, who's who.
Right.
They all, the name, it was very, very confusing situation. But those brothers uh, started in the jewelry business in Chicago and then moved into various cities in the Southwest. So one of them moved to Tulsa and opened a jewelry store in Tulsa. And I'll come back to that story in a minute.
Mhm.
But there was also a branch of the family in Texarkana, Arkansas,
Oh my word.
and in Fort Worth,
Wow.
and spread through the Southwest. When I was probably about 13 or 14, we had an invitation to come to my grandfather's brother's 50th wedding anniversary in Tulsa. Uh, he had become extraordinarily wealthy. He owned the largest department store in Tulsa. He had a fabulous house. Uh, Everybody was in awe that at the time, this is the 1950s, we were told the sprinkler system for the house to keep the grass growing had cost $10,000,
Oh
which
my.
in
And
those days, an
this
amazing amount of money.
it was the cost of a person's house.
Yes, yes, yes. So we had this fabulous party, went to this fabulous party, and I got introduced to a collection of relatives I'd never met before, but who had assimilated into American culture just amazingly. So one of Louis' sons, I guess, no, it was a grandson, later went to West Point, uh, wound up retiring as a colonel. He'd been an attaché and military attaché in Canada. He had a number of very responsible jobs. I later ran into him when I was working for the Senate, and he was stationed at the Pentagon. So this was a very interesting, to say the least, interesting family.
I'll say.
Well, later, but it not atypical, I have to say, of Jewish immigration and spread of people around the country and the different ways in which they found a life here in the United States.
True.
So a very, very interesting collection. But to come back to the Tulsa story, and this is a little bit out of order, but you'll get the point. Years later, this is now 1967, 68. I was working for the Senate, and I was working on a particular piece of legislation in which newspapers were trying to get an exemption from the antitrust laws. One of the newspapers involved that was in violation of the law needed the exemption, though the two newspapers in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I went to Tulsa to talk to the owners, the families that owned these two newspapers.
Oh no, was it your own family?
No, no, no.
Oh God, thank
no, no, no. Now, this is the heart of the story. When we had gone to that 50th wedding anniversary in Tulsa, we were at a country club that my relative in Tulsa had helped build. And it was the Jewish country club because, of course, Jews were excluded, as were every other non-white,
Christian.
Christian, you know, sorry you can't come to the country club, but this country club was twice as elegant. He made a point of making sure that it was much better than the country club. Anyway, I come to Tulsa and I meet with the owners of these two newspapers, and right out of the box, they say, and can you join us for lunch at the country club? To which I said, I'm sorry, I have another engagement, and that's with a relative of mine. Oh, you have a relative here in Tulsa? I said, yes, and he's one of your major advertisers. And, you know, they look at me like, who's that? And I said, that was Louis Clark, and they went into shock, you know, because they knew. And Tulsa.
But when you were there, you were investigating these newspapers, weren't you?
Yes.
I'm surprised they were so loving about bringing
it was a congenial conversation because they wanted the legislation that I was working on. So they were trying to be nice to me.
I see.
But anyway, that was a wonderful ironic moment.
I'll say
to come back at them and say, guys, you know. Now, of course, the other aspect of this that's so strange is here we are on the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre.
Right, of course.
And I was exposed to a piece of Tulsa bigotry that was aimed at Jews, but there was never any mention or discussion of what was happening to people of a different skin color. And that was so bad that nobody talked about it at all.
Right.
So,
and we're learning so much more and more about just how bad it was too.
Yes, we're learning more and more about that. But one should know that it wasn't just Blacks who were in trouble in Tulsa. In those earlier days, Jews were not exactly looked on with favor either.
Yeah, I'll say. I mean, that's the story of only because we've been able to, you know, blend in because we don't have to hide the color of our skin.
Right.
Only for that reason have we been able to emerge, you know, from basically a systematic sense of us versus them in this country.
Yes. And also a lot of this has to do with the break from the kind of strict orthodoxy that I grew up in, where the idea of the other was a big deal.
Yeah.
That is, although we weren't like the Hasidim and locked everybody else out of the community and only dealt with our own and had as our major language Yiddish, which is the Hasidic way, we blended in, but there was still an obvious separation. And the town that I grew up in, for example, the neighborhoods were pretty rigidly divided. So there was the Eastern Orthodox neighborhood, there was the Catholic neighborhood, there was the Jewish neighborhood, and people tended not to cross over very much from one to the other, or for that matter, deal with each other.
Right.
And in the Orthodox world, it was forbidden for anybody who was an Orthodox Jew to set foot in a church.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that was considered a sin.
I mean, this is right. This is the Orthodox forbid themselves from any other of their own fellow Orthodox Jews from entering a church.
Yeah.
You can't even step foot in it.
Yeah. Yes, you're now bringing me to why I bailed on all of this.
Right. Because you have a critical mind, and you have a Jewish heart but a critical mind, and those oftentimes, in Orthodox Judaism, it's a little harder, because the moment you start to question is the moment where there's room for questioning. There is. I don't want to demonize it. Like, there is room for questioning it, but ultimately there is this belief that you can question all you want, but I'm going to be able, or will, as an Orthodox institution, be able to provide you with the answers which will show that your questions are good ones, but they don't hold up. It's not enough to
Right.
debunk what it is that we're doing here.
Right.
And that's the hard part, because the moment you keep pushing and say, yeah, but, and and they say, yeah, well, you can't look at it that way. And if they don't give you the room to look at it in a different way, that's when things start to bump heads there.
Yeah. It really is a closed world, in the sense of questioning is not something that is really welcomed, at least questioning on a serious level.
How did you do it? Like, when was this, for lack of a better word, when was this exodus? I use that word gently, but like,
well, it was at the point where I made decisions about going to college. I say I made decisions. Actually, a lot of that was directed by my parents, because both of my parents, mother and father, were relatively secular. And my mother had studied to be a mathematician in college, and got an advanced degree in math, and wound up coming out of all of that just as the Depression hit.
why didn't your grandparents force more of an orthodoxy on your mom?
Well, that's interesting. I think that was my grandfather, who was much more involved in the outer world, because he, after all, had as his clientele all of these people who worked on Wall Street. The town I grew up in, Elizabeth, was where it was then a commuter town, and there were direct rail lines to the ferry to take you to Wall Street.
Right.
So he had a lot of connections with people who were part of the world.
I see.
And people.
When he died, your mom kind of went
Yeah.
back into a more isolated and insulated
Right.
place. I
Right.
see.
So that was probably why she was able to escape a little bit more and have a little bit more of a different outlook.
Right.
And even my grandmother got into some of that world a bit, but still very much in the Orthodox mold. As an example, one of my grandfather's customers, as it were, in his tailoring business, was, and he met him probably very early, I would say 1900 or thereabouts. He was a broker at a then well-known Wall Street firm. And he was a descendant of probably one of the original families, Dutch families that settled New York.
Wow.
And he was part of a brokerage firm. His name was Schuyler Van Vechten. Still remember him. And he was part of a brokerage firm called Lee Higginson and Company. This guy and my grandfather became friends, and he helped him manage his finances. And later, he helped my grandmother, and he would stop doing work. He was pretty senior by the time this all happened. He would stop everything when my grandmother showed up and help her, talk to her about what she should do with money and how she should handle money.
Mm-hmm.
This was now well into the 1950s. And by then, all sorts of things had happened. There are some family stories there too. But it's a very strange kind of thing, because there were some levels at which the world was more or less dealing with the rest of the world, that is the Jewish world.
Right.
And there were areas where the Jewish world sort of couldn't get it together.
Yeah. Yep. I totally know. I totally.
And that was really a tough kind of thing to sort through. But I figured out that, I was being pushed hard by Rabbi Teitz and the people who were back in Elizabeth. What I really should do would be continue on. The worst case would be going to Yeshiva University, which they considered not quite good enough when it came to uh,
The
Gemara
Judaic stuff,
studying. Yeah,
right? Because
it was a
yeshivas
little
was a
too
legit,
secular, but hey,
was
you
a
know,
was a
they
thoroughly
told me.
Jewish but secular, but also it highlighted secular disciplines at yeshiva.
Yes, yes. So they were thinking that I should stick around and go for smicha across the street at the Mesivta. I said thanks, but no thanks. And as I think I said to you once, I was not going to spend my life deciding whether chickens were kosher. That was just not going to be
So
where my head was.
so your kind of exodus, let's call it, happened around the time when you graduated high school.
Oh, that's right.
And so what happened? So first of all, where did you end up going to college?
Well, I wound up going to a place called Bard College, and there's another place where I really did learn a lot, not only about the world, but about Judaism. And you'll say, well, that was a very secular college. Yes, it was. But the college at that time had as its faculty numbers of people who were Jewish refugees from Germany
Right.
who had been admitted to the US because of their academic qualifications and were now teaching in the US and had established sort of a university in exile, if you will. And the people were all part of what was the now liberal Judaism, to the extent they were connected to Judaism. Many of them weren't really connected, but there were a couple of the faculty people who I ran into who were very much of the German liberal Jewish community, which had history going back to the 1840s, 1850s, and had really, in most ways, become secular. And, they were Jewish, but they were part of the world.
Yeah.
And some of the faculty there, it was an amazing faculty. And I was very fortunate. So the teachers I had included a couple of people who escaped from the Nazis different times. There was a rabbi actually who had been a Reform rabbi, Dr. Eugen Kuhlmann, and he really, I think he got his degree from the college in Cincinnati.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so this was a very interesting group of people, and as a result of all of that, one of the professors I had, who by the by was not Jewish, but for all practical purposes might have been, was the man who was the husband of Hannah Arendt. And through him, I got to know her. And after he died, I got to know her quite well and worked with her. And that was phenomenal as well. I got to meet people like W.H. Auden and Mary McCarthy and a whole collection of people in the literary world. But there was a group, and they called themselves, this was fascinating because when she died at the funeral, there was a group of people there that referred to themselves as the tribe. And that was the group of people who had been Jews who fled Germany.
Right.
And one way or another found their way to New York. And they were teaching at City College. They were teaching at the New School. And these people were at the top of what I would call the cultural world in every respect. And they were connected with the best of American art, literature,
Yeah.
every aspect of American life. And the degree to which they enriched American life is really remarkable.
Hold on. Let me focus us here a second. What was it like for you what was Judaism like for you when you were in college or law school? Like, did you just kind of, were you nothing, or did you already transition to liberal Judaism?
Pretty well. In law school, you say, was it nothing? Well, in a way it was, because just to give you an idea of what the law school experience was like, I remember when the Beatles first came to America. That was in the period that I was in law school, and everybody kept talking about the Beatles, and I had no idea what they were talking about because I spent so much time in the library. So divorced from the party music, God knows what scene, that, who knew?
So it wasn't, so what you're saying is that during law school, you didn't kind of like forget about your Judaism because you were rejecting it per se. You forgot about your Judaism because you rejected everything in the world other than your legal books.
But yes and no, because at the same time, there were a lot of issues that I was involved in that really didn't let me forget. So it was things like the discrimination of this law firm, which I got kicked off the Columbia campus, so they weren't allowed to interview again for 3 years after their rather horrible discrimination. And also efforts to begin the process of integration. And I'm now talking about bringing people of color into the program. I mean, and even women. I mean, you have to understand that out of a class, my class of roughly 300, there might have been 10 women.
All right, but so hold on. But like in your third year of law school,
yes,
and Pesach rolls around,
right.
What's your Seder?
I go home. We have a Seder at home. Sure.
Right. I got you. And are you not thirsting isn't the word, but are you reveling in kind of the memory of that type of?
Of course. I mean, one develops a real attachment to a number of things.
Right.
The music, the tunes of a service, the songs, and all of that is something that becomes part of you. It's not something you can just have disappear. It's sort of hardwired into your brain.
All right, so we have I'm looking at my watch. We've got a little bit less than 10 minutes to go. And so I want to ask you a couple of other questions. I want to get off tell me about Israel. What's your connection to Israel?
Well, that is another saga, which is
because I know you've got a strong relationship.
Remember the period of Israel coming to life was about the period 1946, 47. Of
course.
I'm just beginning to be a kid, who knows what's going on. And there was really high excitement about Israel because of all of the things that had happened in Europe. And the biggest single thing that sticks in my mind was the business of when the war ended, and there were tens of thousands of people, and Jews today tend to forget it, who were released from the camps.
But had no place to go.
But they had no place to go.
Right.
They were told, sorry, you can't come back to Poland, to Germany, to wherever.
That's right.
Their property had been confiscated. They had nothing.
They were living in DP camps, and even they were living even in Israel itself. There's a famous one called Atlit, just south of Haifa, in Israel, but not officially in Israel.
Right. So this business of the DP camps and the effort to get people into Israel was something that was very much on the table when I was growing up. And the terrible performance of the British and the horrible reactions of the Europeans to all of this,
right,
were things that were very much part of my growing up, and had me very much on the side of, well, these are people who need to go to Israel, and Israel has a real purpose here. Uh, the complications of all of this came later on, and I have to sort of take a minute here to describe some of that. Uh, in that early period, Menachem Begin was a terrorist, flat, plain. There was no other way to describe it. And his attitude was, we've got to blast those British out of here, and we're going to get these people in. And a guy who you actually officiated his funeral, who I was very close to for a long time, Maurice Rosenblatt, was one of the architects of working through this problem of getting these DPs into what would become Israel, and then to defend Israel. And I think one of the things we had in his estate was a table that he had on which very important documents relating to the founding of Israel had been signed.
Wow.
That, so there was a whole connection here that I had over a period of years. And then there's another story about this, which was a story that Hannah Arendt told me about her meeting with Golda Meir. And they were discussing the problem of what kind of country would Israel be? Would it be a democracy that was obviously like all others, that welcomed all people, that had complete religious freedom, and was not a theocratic state?
Right.
And she and Golda Meir discussed it, and they agreed that it would probably be better to be a real democracy and an open state. But Golda Meir said, but we can't do that. And the question was, well, why can't you do that? And the answer back was, we need the support of the Jews from around the world.
Right.
Without that, we won't survive.
Right.
And if we say we're a secular democracy, they won't be interested in supporting us.
Right.
And the discussion was a very difficult and obviously important one.
Mm-hmm. I know.
So
it's a very
debate that's still at the heart of a lot of what the
going on right now.
Exactly.
That conversation is still alive.
That is something that plain hasn't been resolved, and it's made especially difficult by the allowing and encouraging the most horrible, I would say, of the Hasidic community to run their piece of the world their way and get away with it. We're not going to serve in the army. We're not going to, this stuff is just
they're harsh and insistence that Israel's all theirs from north to south. I mean, that makes it very complicated.
That they wouldn't recognize you as Jewish.
Right.
That they wouldn't recognize a marriage that you performed.
Right. I mean, it's terrible.
It is terrible. And how to resolve that is something I can't fathom. I had high school classmates who became rabbis, who made an aliyah. They were all big deal in Israel and all the rest of it. And I couldn't put any of that together. And it's been a very difficult thing for me to sort through. And it's kind of really strange because despite the fact that I've traveled to practically everywhere in the world, I've never been to Israel.
Oh, Jack, you got to do this.
That's true.
I'm already signing you up for our trip in 2022 because that's crazy. You've got to go.
Wow. Yeah, it would make sense. God knows I had a former law partner who, when he retired, made an aliyah, and he became a lieutenant in the Israeli Police Reserve. And
wow. No, but also because, I mean, I know that you have, I seem to remember us having a conversation that you actually have many personal professional experiences working with Arafat
yeah,
and I think it was Rabin together. And
yeah.
so that's, I mean, and I'm like embarrassed to say, like, I need to have like a part B of our conversation, because I feel like this is insufficient. We didn't even touch upon you at Temple Beth Shalom, although the early part's better than the later part anyway. But
Yeah, well, the early part is, I think, the most important to have on Zoom tape, because there are very few people who've been through the kind of world that I was in.
that's right.
Remember that that's now fading, the number of people who are still alive who were in that world. But I had a very peculiar experience bridging one foot in this very Orthodox world, being thrown back into the Lower East Side, the Educational Alliance, the immigrant group,
Right.
learning about things like the Arbeiterbund in New York, which
Right.
was the workman's circle and the beginning of labor movement, which all came out of Jews who had fled Europe at one point or another.
Yeah.
And to have one foot in that world and then to move into all of these other worlds, really,
It's
it
unique.
was a unique
It's
experience.
unique. So listen to me, Jack. With sadness, I have to
Yes.
cut this conversation short. There's a very decent chance we might be doing a part B, because there's so much more to talk about. But with sadness, I have to cut this conversation short. But I just want to thank you so much for giving me the chance to talk and having us put this on tape. And this is gonna go on our YouTube page. And something tells me this is going to be a really exciting one for people to listen to. And it's been, my interviews have been well received. So look, this one I think is going to be equally interesting. So
Sure.
your story is amazing, but I think there may be a part B coming in our future. So Jack, I have to sign off for now, but I so greatly appreciate the time that you spent with me. I'm so
Thank you.
so much gratitude. Be well, my friend.
Take care.
You too. Take care.
Bye.